Hello, Thomas. Wanted to take a swing at this. You kind of stepped on one of my buttons with the science and religion and dogma thing. And I think that what you're saying is true. I don't like dogma in science. I think that dogma doesn't belong in science. And so I try to keep my astrotometry channel separate from my patterns and chaos and my more spiritual stuff. But I think I owe you, we were talking back so long ago, I don't remember when, you were trying to wrap your head around what I was saying about the nature of hypertime, and you were looking for a sort of paper or something you could read on it. And I can point you to Walter Russell on that now. Walter was moving very, very much along the same lines that I've arrived to where I am with astrotometry in his understanding of how matter manifests. And I think that where a lot of people get confused about, especially about, for example, the nature of quantum mechanics, I don't think that science should reduce observations. Science has to acknowledge observations. Science has to acknowledge all of the available observations in order to advance as science and not be dogma. And so when we have these sorts of experiments, such as the entanglement of the photon, or the double slit experiment, or the absence of a Coriolis force on the Earth, the absence of centripetal force on the Earth, the anomalies with gravity, these types of experiments that can be reproduced, these types of things that are very real things. We need to search for answers for this. We can't just latch on to some type of scientific explanation that is a reduction for what we are seeing and call that science. That's not science. And so I want to take another swing at trying to explain, when I figured out the nature of hypertime, when I came up with a model for my explanation for why the photon entangles, why the Earth doesn't have enough Coriolis force, why the centripetal force isn't present on a supposedly spinning Earth, how the discrepancy between the matter-energy conservation relationship relates to what should be, if Newton was correct, the orbit of light at a particular distance from the Earth. These are all anomalies in the scientific theory. These are things that are inconsistent with inside science. And to just accept these things without moving and changing is to create a dogma. And ironically, with astrotometry, what I've done, I believe, is uncovered a link between science and spirituality, in that what I'm proposing resonates very deeply with some of the most profound insights from all the way back to the I Ching. And so to understand that is to understand that this physical reality is a sort of illusion, that when you see light, that the observational mechanism is actually moving through time to produce that perception of light. Now, Einstein tried to sort this out with special relativity and general relativity, but he didn't really take into consideration the actual mechanics of how things are moving through time. And in astrotometry, that has to do with the nature of an object. Like if you have a pattern, an object, just any object, it's a general theory. This is actually something that has to do with perception. And so anything that observes this object is in a sense moving relative to it in a way that allows the object's frequency form that exists in three-dimensional space to be observed. And so you can't take the consciousness out of it and call it science. You can't take the consciousness of what is the reference frame out of it. Can't take the physics of that consciousness out of it. What we know about the nature of particles and waves on the quantum mechanical level has to be integrated. Otherwise, our science is going to be inconsistent. It's going to be dogma. And so in astrotometry, I'm proposing that this, as what I call a node pattern, actually is a waveform that moves in 6 directions. Now, this is consistent, I believe, with what Walter Russell was getting at in his theory about how things manifest. And so in these directions, these 6 directions, fall naturally out of the geometry of three-dimensional space. So our perception of three-dimensional space itself has to do with the nature of the movement of things through time. In order to perceive one moment of this, these things have to come in from where the observer would be observing it in order for the object to be observed. And this is an incredibly difficult concept to wrap your head around. This is an incredibly difficult thing. But anytime you have one point in space, if you have a single point in space, you talk about just Cartesian analysis of a point. In 3 dimensions, it has an x, y, and z coordinate. And that x-axis, that y-axis, and that z-axis have 2 directions each. They're both bidirectional. And those bidirectional axes fall naturally into this 6-directional form. Now, in the I Ching, and in for example, the study of the Merkaba, is the understanding of how consciousness produces this. Because you've got these 4 directions, which are the directions that the planet itself would be a plane on. And then you've got up and down. And in the I Ching, it's heaven and earth. And then you've got north, south, east, and west. And these are polarized. We have a polarization between what we experience as up and what we experience as down. Down is solid, up is free. And there's gravity that pulls in this direction. And the sun comes across the earth from east to west. There's a polarity, there is a natural polarity that is supersymmetric with the cosmos. That this is a symptom of, that this is a perceptual issue of. And I believe that the rest period in the beginning of Genesis is discussing this exact same thing. Because in the I Ching, they say a return, that this point is the return of these 6 directions. They call this 7th stage in the I Ching the return. I think that was mistranslated in the Bible, and I think the word day was also mistranslated. These are the days. These are the quarters of the heavens. This is the Selah, I think, in Genesis. And when I realized this, it completely changed my world view. I mean, completely, because I was already familiar with Genesis. I was already familiar with I Ching. I just didn't understand them. I don't believe I understood them, and so I've kind of moved on that, and it's changed my life incredibly. But as far as dogma goes, we can't pretend that these other things, that these other experiments in science don't exist. See, this explains the photon spin entanglement, because for example, if this particle is a photon, you can use any particle you want as an example. If this particle is a photon, the reason that these two places where the photon is observed is entangled is because this wave recurs on itself, because there's a sort of recurrence of this wave through the time space. And so the object, it's not the same object from moment to moment. The photon moves this way and this way to become what it is in the moment. And so there's this sort of eternity that is bound into, every physical object. There's a connection that everything has with everything else that is a very, very real physical connection. And I think this is there's a book called Everything Forever that discusses this, and this relationship is, I think it's key in science. And I think that if we can understand these anomalous experiments with this idea, with this concept, that the observer's movement through time is producing the perception of three-dimensional space, then I think a lot of this dogma that we have in science, we're just going to have to step back and go, wait a minute, we just don't know anything about what's going on. And I think I'm coming back around full circle with what you said at the beginning. You know, we have to admit that what we're logically, rationally deducing about the nature of our reality is only a logical, rational deduction, and that has limitations.